Colleen, if I'm a shifter and you're an absorber, we're going to become friends really fast because we
Yeah.
both agree everything is your fault and
Right.
you're the one who's apologizes, etc. And that's a pretty stable system until the absorber, you, get fed up
Yeah.
and are like, I'm tired of doing all of the work in the relationship.
Today we have a very, very special guest. Her name is Sheila Heen. Sheila Heen is many things to many people. Here are a few. Professor at Harvard Law, Deputy Director of the Harvard Negotiation Project, co-author of the New York Times bestsellers Difficult Conversations, How to Discuss What Matters Most, with the recently released updated third edition. Thanks for the feedback, the science and art of receiving feedback well, even when it's off base, unfair, poorly delivered, and frankly, you're not in the mood. And I also just want to give a shout out to your 2012 piece in Modern Love, Sleeping with the Political Enemy, which is also fantastic. Sheila's written many more things. She's also the founder of Triad Consulting Group, where she's worked with clients spanning the NBA, the Federal Reserve Bank, the Singaporean Supreme Court, the Obama White House, and theologians struggling with disagreements over the nature of truth and God. I was personally lucky enough to be a teaching fellow during, I think it was the 2017 J-term negotiation workshop, HLS, where I got to see Sheila Heen not only in skillful action in the room, but I'm thinking about being in Pound Hall, Sheila, with other negotiation titans and the teaching fellows kind of on the outskirts of the arena and watching you make really skillful moves. And, you know, what I would say is walking the talk, which has always stuck out to me. And for me, it would have been enough to have been a part of that experience, and to have you on the podcast is absolutely surreal. So thank you so much for being here.
It's great to see you again. And that community of humans, I think, is what keeps all of us engaged. Yeah.
So I want to go there into that community because I'd like to think that Colleen and I are also in hoping to be gardeners in that field.
Yeah.
So before we go into Harvard Negotiation Project and that community, I'm wondering, can you tell us the story of your name, Sheila?
Well, it's interesting because I thought I knew the story of my name, but just this past month, there's been a twist, which is interesting. So I don't know that there's a particular story around my first name. I certainly, as a young adult or teenager, questioned my mother about it a lot because Sheila is an unusual name, and on television, the Sheilas are usually, background characters. They're killed off early, whatever. And she just liked the name. But my last name is pretty unique. And the family story is that my father, who's John Henry Heen, his father was John Norman Heen, his father was John Olaf Heen. John Olaf Heen was 4 years old when he came with his father, Gustav, from Norway. And the story is that at some point, right around that prior generation, the name was Olsen. And when they came to the United States, they changed it to Heen because it was the farm and village that they were from outside of Oslo. So there aren't very many Heens. And when I was a teenager and young adult and traveling and got to a new city, the first thing I would do is open the phone book and see if there were any other Heens. And there never were until I went to Honolulu. And there were 13 Heens in the phone book.
Whoa.
So that was always curious to me, but I didn't really know anything more about it. Well, I was in Honolulu last month teaching, and a guy comes up to me at the break and he says, "Is Heen your maiden name or your married name?" And I said, "It's my maiden name." And he says, "Well, I'm Paolo Heen." And I would put money on the fact that we are related.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
And I said, "Okay, talk to me. How is that possible? Because the story in my family is blah, blah, blah from this farm outside of Oslo." And he said, yeah, generations back, there was a connection between farmers in Heen, in outside Oslo, and in China. And part of my family came from China to Honolulu, I am also part Native Hawaiian, but that is why there are so many Heens in Hawaii.
Wow.
And we have been Supreme Court justices and, state senators and, leaders in Hawaii for a very long time. And that's why there are so many Heens here.
Wow.
He's like, I'm going to
cool.
bet that we're related and we'll track it down. It was so cool.
That's amazing.
It's amazing. Amazing. So yeah, we're following up and I'm going to learn more of the full story. So I don't know the story of my name. I've just discovered.
It's evolving. Yeah.
Still
It's evolving.
It sounds like the more rare the surname, you have like kind of the cost of never really finding someone else. But when you do, that's like such a pure automatic relationship thing that it's just self.
It is, and in the age of the internet, of course, having a more unusual last name, as you may also know, Max, is a real gift.
What?
It's just a little bit easier for people to find you.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have to ask. I mean, there's so many things. I'm wondering to what extent, just while we're in family territory, to what extent family systems or the family relates to negotiation, relates to difficult conversations.
Oh my gosh, how doesn't it relate? Partly because I think both consciously and unconsciously, we learn so much about conflict and negotiation and what can be talked about and what shouldn't be talked about and how you're successful in getting your way as a kid and getting what you want or what you need. So many of those strategies are honed in childhood. So all of us have been negotiating our whole lives is something that we often say. And what we less often dig into are the ways in which those early strategies show up for us as adults. I think that a couple of things have stuck with me. Number one, those strategies are often default strategies under stress. Mm-hmm. And that as negotiators, as we get more experienced, our experience is often deeper but not broader. Mm-hmm. So our go-to strategies that are successful most of the time, we lean into more and more heavily. We get better and better at those.
Yep.
But that means we don't develop a broader repertoire.
That opportunity cost, yeah.
Yeah. The other thing that has certainly been front of mind for me, particularly because I'm about to be an empty nester. So my youngest will go to college this fall. And in talking with people about sibling relationships, I think one of the things that happens is that over time, that sibling relationship, when you have it, and it comes in all different forms, develops resentments because of those habits. Right? So you always get your way in the following ways, or mom or stepdad favors you more than me, right? Or my husband is one of 4 boys. My husband also teaches negotiation. But his older brother, he's number 2, his older brother used to torture him as a kid because there was 1 red cup and 1 blue cup. They were the coveted items. And if Jim, his brother, got the blue cup, John would just feel like, I want the blue cup. And Jim would say, I have the blue cup. I have the blue cup, just to torture him, right? And then eventually someone would intervene, or Jim would go like, fine, you can have the blue cup. And they'd switch, and then Jim would go, I have the red cup. I have the red cup.
It sounds like some winner's curse a little bit, or just like, I wonder what is that positional thing that gets maintained.
Yeah, I mean, I have a twin sister, so I know this.
Oh, you do? Colleen, talk to us. Well. Talk to us.
It's going to come out on this podcast sooner or later. But yeah, I actually think that she was earlier to talking than I was. Mm-hmm. I was earlier to walking than she was. Mm-hmm. And she would translate on my behalf, and I think a lot of my life's work I feel like that's why I did a PhD in some regard, is like, it felt like I was always trying to express these feelings that I didn't quite understand. Yeah. And in some ways it was like this beautiful gift of having someone baked in who got me, you know, who really understood
Mm-hmm.
me. But I so resonate with, I have an older sister as well, and I so resonate with that sister relationship as being the first place that we sort of figure out how to figure out ourselves and how to articulate that and have those difficult conversations. I'm curious, Difficult Conversations, your book is such a seminal text. And I'm wondering what nudged you? What was the probe? What was the first germ of the thought for this book? How did it come about?
And if I can just add on to that question, which is poor form, to what extent was your family life a factor in doing what you do?
Well, it's easy to look at my family and say, well, something was going on there, because my dad is a attorney and a negotiator, and certainly we negotiated for what we wanted as kids very much. Not debate. It wasn't acrimonious, but it was like trying to influence what we wanted more explicitly than I think is the case in some families. When I was, 10, anyway, young, I always had a pony at the top of my list. And my father would, of birthday, Christmas, etc., my father would say, save your pennies. So I caught on that was the criteria, right?
Nice.
And so eventually, when I was about 10, I came to him. I chose my timing carefully when he really wasn't paying attention, was preoccupied with something else, and said, so if I do save my pennies and can pay for it, can I have a horse? And he said, sure. Later told me, of course, he figured, what are the chances of that?
Yeah.
So I got a paper route, and 6 months later bought my first horse.
Whoa.
So
I never knew that, Jill. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Sheila, that is so impressive. And also tells us so much about
a little
your
driven.
capacity.
Yeah, doesn't
So
say
I
no
did
for an
it.
answer. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's a strength and a shadow side, definitely, too. I'll figure out a way to do it. The persistence. I fell off that horse probably 7 times the first week. He broke every piece of equipment I bought him. He was ornery.
Wow.
And so after a couple of years of a lot of learning curve for me, I then sold him to my sister and bought a different horse.
This is the best story.
Speaking of sibling relationships, right?
This is the best story.
Yeah.
That sister, by the way, is a doctor, a surgeon now. My youngest sister also teaches negotiation, as you guys know. So yeah, there's something going on in our family around negotiation. And then I married a negotiator, etc. But that maybe brings us up to, Colleen, what you were asking, earliest germs. Like, I can look back and see them. I don't think I could have looked forward and identified them, as is the way in life, unfortunately. But when I was deciding where to go to law school, and I was deciding between Stanford and Harvard, my college advisor said, Harvard has this negotiation thing. And I just have a feeling it might be your deal. But also, Harvard was the big scary choice. I didn't know anyone there. It was one of the biggest law schools in the country. I think it was the biggest at the time. And so I signed up for negotiation my first year and totally fell in love with it. And by the time I was a third year and we had to write a third year paper to graduate, I wrote my third year paper on a very difficult conversation that I had observed and didn't know what to do about. So I took that apart in my third year paper, which was supervised by Bruce Patton.
Yeah.
And simultaneous to that, in law school, I had a very, one of those on-again, off-again relationships that I'd watched my friends have and just thought they were idiots. Like, just break up, you guys. I can't go through this anymore. As your friend.
Yeah. I need to break
Right.
up.
I need you to break up and stay broken up. I can't handle it.
Yeah.
I've had enough. Yes.
Yeah.
I've had my heart broken too many times as your friend. And then, of course, I had my own karma. And because I was a negotiation person by that point and a teaching fellow, I just felt like, what am I not getting that I can't negotiate my way out of this relationship? And it took longer than it should have for me to realize, oh, this is not a negotiation. I don't have to persuade him that it's not working. I don't have to persuade him that breaking up is the right answer, which from an identity point of view, I felt like I did, because he kept saying, you're not giving it a chance. You're being unfair. That's criteria. A big hook for me, criteria. And it took me longer than it should have to realize, oh, I don't have to persuade him. If it's not working for me, it's not working for me. And that's the end of it. It's a BATNA, not an option.
Yeah. Nice.
And so that was happening for me during my third year. And simultaneous to that, unbeknownst to me yet, Bruce and Doug were talking about what we were learning doing this exercise called the interpersonal skills exercise with hundreds and thousands of people, which invites people to bring a real tough negotiation or difficult conversation, and we take it apart, take a look at what's getting you stuck, think about what might help. And what they were noticing, and I was doing it as a TF, a teaching fellow already, was that there were patterns to what things that would come up that were getting people stuck and that were helping. And so Doug pitched to Bruce, hey, I think there's maybe a book here. Why don't we see if we can figure out what the patterns are? So by the time I graduated and came on, joined them full time as a staff person, they were already, in fact, the first thing that Doug asked me to do when I started work full time was he handed me what he had sat down and just written over the summer. He just did a brain dump over the summer of everything he could think of. He said, why don't you read this and see what you think?
Wow.
And you can see it was a mess, of course, as brain dumps are, but you can see a lot of what ended up in difficult conversations there in inchoate form. If you would look at that plus my third year paper, plus some of the things that Bruce was working on at the time.
Yeah. It's so interesting because I feel like a lot of what you're talking about that I've felt is this disjunction between thinking my way out of something or thinking my way through something or having enough training, knowledge, etc., to in a moment act a certain way or override the visceral feelings. And the inadequacy of that, no matter how much I practice it. Yeah. So it's just interesting to think about that as a supplemental or sort of, I actually almost feel like preceding some of the negotiation tools, right? Like if you can't first understand that, how can you then make use of any of these tools? And understanding it isn't even dealing with it. It's just looking at it, I guess. I don't know. Was that when you were thinking about this book, where you talk about, actually, why don't you discuss, there's sort of three things going on when we're having difficult conversations. And the question is about the feelings part of that. But can you tell people what three things are typically happening when we're having difficult conversations?
Yeah, I think that one of the most important insights for me was that if we want to understand these conversations, you have to look at what people are thinking and feeling, not just what they're saying, partly because what we're saying is a tiny subset of what we're thinking and feeling. Sometimes it's reactive and unwise. Sometimes it's very careful and edited, but it's hard to see what's really going on. But if you look beneath the surface, like with an X-ray, at what people are really thinking and feeling during the conversations, what you start to see is that actually it's quite predictable what we're preoccupied with when we're in conflict with other people. And by the way, the idea of the internal voice, I mean, I suppose we dubbed it that, the internal voice. However, we were really building on work by Chris Ardress and Diana McLean-Smith and Bob Putnam and Phil MacArthur, the action science folks who created the ladder of inference, and they were calling it the left-hand column. Like on a piece of paper, if you put the dialogue of what you were saying on the right, on the left, write down what you were really thinking, right? So we were also doing that work, and in the exercise, we were inviting people to expound upon what they're really thinking in this moment, as they then choose, okay, now what do we think we should say? Let's practice how it would go. So anyway, if you look at what people are really thinking and feeling in their internal voice, it is really predictable, and it falls into 3 buckets. So the first is that we each have a story of what happened, what did happen, what is happening right now, and what I think should happen. And that story itself has 3 subcomponents, which is a little confusing, but true, about that are important pieces of the story. So one is that I tend to be focused on what I'm right about.
Mm.
A second, I'm wondering whose fault this is that we're having this problem. Sometimes I'm not wondering, I'm pretty sure I know whose fault it is. It's not necessarily easier, by the way, when it's their fault. Sometimes when it's my fault, it's the hardest. You choose your poison. And then the third piece of the story is that I have a hypothesis, or sometimes feel pretty certain, about why they're acting this way. What's motivating them? And then that makes up my story about what happened. And that's sort of the quote unquote facts, or what I experience as the facts. But there are 2 more things underneath that. There's a question of all the feelings. By the time something becomes a difficult conversation, one or often both parties have some pretty strong feelings, and we're each sometimes trying to decide what to do with those feelings or how to manage the other person's feelings. And then at the deepest level is what we call the identity conversation, that there's something the situation suggests about me that feels like it's at stake. Like when I couldn't quite end that relationship, am I an unfair person, an uncaring person, an unloving person? Whatever it was not who I wanted to be. And so there's something going on for identity for at least one, if not both people. And I've just told the story in that order, but it happens in the opposite order. Like identity gets hooked, that amplifies the feelings and reactions that we have and the anxiety we have. And then that colors the way that we tell the story. Yeah, totally.
This is, at least for me, very, very helpful. I don't know if I ever told you this. I had this conversation with Bruce, but difficult conversations helped my relationship with my family tremendously, and specifically because I'm also someone who gets overwhelmed very easily. And so having something saying, oh, okay, this one thing is difficult because it is 3 things was helpful to just say like, hey, can we enter this space where we're going to become more nuanced? We're going to break things down. Now, so I just finished difficult conversations with my cohort in MCI Concord, which we could talk about.
Yeah. Oh, I want to hear.
But so the first shift you talk about, and you see this very commonly, that people are fighting over their story, who's right, who's wrong. The shift in the book in difficult conversations is to, whether you want to call it the third story or a learning conversation, it's something else that's not being right or being wrong. And I'm wondering if you can explain what that shift is.
Yeah. Well, probably the most fundamental aspect of the shift is that it's shifting your purpose from explaining why you're right or getting them to fill in the blank, persuading them to change, to apologize, whatever, to stop being so horrible. So it's a shift from that purpose to, first, let me just understand why we see it so differently and what is going on. And if I can get a better sense of the more complete picture, that process of understanding each other will just put us in a different place to now figure out what to do. We still may disagree, but we have a better sense of why we disagree and whether there are possibilities for us if we need to continue to collaborate or improve the way that we're collaborating so that we can lower the transaction cost of that collaboration for each of us, because we're both frustrated, I now understand. And we're each contributing to the problem. So I think it's stepping outside my own story to feel like my job is to get you to understand my story. I need you to get me. And instead stepping to, you called it the third position, sort of an observer's perspective of, let's understand first why we each see this so differently. So I need to understand your perspective, and then I'm hopeful that you'll also work to understand mine, and then we'll figure out what to do. And that, if you can shift that purpose, then it naturally shifts how you enter and navigate the conversation, because you just have different goals in mind at the other end.
And can I ask, is the ability to take a third position a matter of cognitive development?
I think it is. Do you?
Yeah, that was one of those leading questions. Well, I'm thinking about Keegan, which Robert Keegan and adult development, and I hadn't discovered. So I'm, if not clear, very interested in kind of like the intellectual history of the Harvard Negotiation Project, which I'd also love for you to talk about a bit. But the idea that we don't stop developing in discernible stages post Piaget is a really cool idea. We just talk about adulthood.
Yeah.
And I like in most of the rooms that I'm in, just saying like, there's no such thing as an adult. I haven't met one yet for the most part. Sheila, you come very, very close. But for the most part, like we may look like adults, but we're making meaning in different ways. And Melissa Manwaring writes a great piece on this, like what we're asking, the cognitive demands of getting TS, something like that. It's fantastic.
Yeah.
And that's also what I kind of try and focus on. And so the question is, does the ability to escape one's own perspective, if that's even possible, get distance from the self, what we consider to be the subject I versus the objects that I can change, that are manipulatable or whatever, don't we need concepts like the third position, concepts like a ladder, to even to have something that we could detach from? Like, so is that not a matter? I would say, I do think it's a matter of development, but how do you do that in in the classroom, in a training room? Like, I'm curious, I guess, to formulate a question. Why is teaching negotiation, difficult conversations, feedback different than other subjects in terms of how we have to teach?
Yeah. I'm glad that you raised this, because it's something that we've been talking a lot about, because as our friend and colleague Rachel Viscomi describes it, it's learning how to hold more than one view as essential and simultaneously true.
Yeah.
So that takes a lot of capacity, cognitive and emotional capacity, in order to do that. And I do think that it is a pretty advanced stage in human development, and also that it's harder in some situations, and it's harder for some people than others, for reasons that we should be empathetic to, because they are also essential, right? So number one, I would say that everybody I meet tends to be stronger in either assertion or empathy, like under stress. Some people will go to, here's what you're not understanding. Like, I need to be heard. You need to hear my voice, my perspective on this, because it's so important. And I think our education system tends to prioritize assertion. Other people, their first instinct is to go to empathy. And, they're really great listeners. People walk away from talking with them feeling really understood. And they do really understand. And they understand so well that they kind of get persuaded, like, well, now that I get your perspective, like, shoot, that makes a lot of sense. I can see why this was so upsetting and hurtful or whatever it would be. And they kind of lose their own perspective. Mm-hmm. And it's only after the conversation that they're like, well, wait a minute, I never said what I think, because I actually disagree with a couple of those things, or it leaves out something really important. And so that journey back to integrate what you've learned to your perspective, I actually think is pretty complex. And so I also think for some people, depending on their life experience, around issues of trauma, that journey is really fraught. Around issues of dominant culture, like I've had to live my life anticipating everybody else's world and story. And if I step there on this particular issue, I will feel like I again lose myself.
Yeah.
And then also for people with some neurodiversity, being able to step to someone else's perspective and have a theory of mind of someone else's perspective is actually quite difficult. You can move the needle, but it's harder. So there are all kinds of reasons why there are both challenges for doing so, and it requires a lot that can be hard, especially on issues that you care so deeply about and that feel threatening to who you are.
I have a leading question. Do you think,
Yay!
Make it two.
do you think women are better at this in general?
Ooh, what a great question. I mean, that's the PR on women, is that we tend to both pay more attention to relationships and be able to hold complexity maybe more easily. I mean, there's some neuro reasons for that, as I understand it, in terms of connections between the two sides of the brain and that kind of thing. At the same time, what's hard about talking about gender is that I can also think of women who are terrible at it and men who are great at it, so it's a little bit tricky. And I'm curious what you think. What have you noticed?
I don't, in general, I led you to a question that I don't love the dichotomy of, right? Which is like, is our biology hardwired to be different? I feel like it's so hard to pull apart from the stigma and expectations of gender in this world. So it's a tricky one to answer. But I do feel like in general, women walk around the world with more of a necessity to understand others' perspectives historically. And so I think that theory of mind, I know there's some research of theory of mind starts a little bit earlier for girls. But I guess part of what I'm asking is also, you talk about blame shifters and blame avoiders and the way that this shows up in difficult conversations. And as we're talking about this, I feel like that relates really well and also has some consequences or similar consequences. Can you tell us a little bit about what blame shifting looks like, what blame avoiding looks like, and how that contributes to this?
Yeah. So I think that because our internal voice, when we're in conflict or something goes wrong, human beings naturally are preoccupied with whose fault this is. And the simplistic place our brain goes is this my fault or somebody else's fault? The answer is usually singular, or it could be a group. Like it's those guys' fault. They're the ones who screwed this up or dropped the ball or are causing a problem. But of course, if you look at systems theory, everybody has in some way contributed to where we are today. Even if your contribution is doing nothing, you can see there was a problem or hints of a problem and it's festered because you haven't learned more or you've avoided having the conversation until now. And that's one piece of why it is as bad as it is today. So each of us have done or failed to do some things that got us where we are today. And just, it's not 50-50, could be 99-1. But understanding that contribution system helps us understand, well, what would we need to change if we wanted to actually fix the problem or not have it recur, next week. And so then the question becomes, when you look at a system and those contributions, some of which may be totally reasonable, blame suggests you did something wrong. Contribution says it could be that you did something wrong, but it also could be you did something that was well-intended and a good thing to do. It's just that now we realize it didn't help. When we look at that system, I think that each of us leans in a particular direction, again, that either I'm a blame shifter. When something goes wrong, my first place to look is everybody else. I'm late because the traffic was bad, right? I'm late because my toddler couldn't find his shoes. Again. What I don't see as easily is my own part of that. Like, have I taught my toddler where to put their shoes? And maybe should I have anticipated that again we would be searching for the shoes, or that at this time of day I needed to leave extra time for traffic? So that would be someone who trends toward being a blame shifter. And I would tell you, in all honesty, that I probably am a blame shifter, except that it's not my fault that I'm a blame shifter. So, I'm not going to admit that. But other people are blame absorbers. When something goes wrong, the first place they point fingers at themselves. Oh, I should have seen this coming. I can't believe I let this happen. I should have known and warned the team. And they're so preoccupied with their own culpability that it's harder for them to hold other people accountable. And so what is interesting to me is that when I work with leaders, many of them will self-identify as absorbers. And it's more popular to say you're an absorber, of course, because the buck stops here and you take responsibility. And if that's actually where you trend, then your challenge is holding everybody accountable in a way that actually improves performance and puts responsibility where it belongs as we work together in working relationships. So I think the question of where does your brain go first and what's harder for you to see is actually a really important question to be asking yourself. And it also shows up in dynamics between people. Because Colleen, if I'm a shifter and you're an absorber, we're going to become friends really fast because we both agree everything is your fault and you're the one who's apologizes, etc. And that's a pretty stable system until the absorber, you, get fed up.
Yeah.
And are like, I'm tired of doing all of the work in the relationship. If you can't see your part or you're not willing to change your part, there's only so far we can go to address our issues.
And Jill, I've heard you mention the shadow self. And now I'm hearing you mention to some extent when we think about individuals, not as pure individuals with individual interests, but sometimes interest in preservation of the group such that we'll engage in maladaptive behaviors. I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about, the clashes of our internal portfolio of interests, or just how messy it can be, or even just that I think one argument about, the identity quake could be that the primary interest we might have is self-coherence, or the ability to hold our worldview and self together in a way that we see it. And when that's threatened, we really want that back in some way. So I guess I'm just wondering, can you talk more about our shadow interests, or I'm thinking about the capuchin monkey video, which we'll link to, and the utility of punishment, even just our darker interests.
Can we throw shame in there?
Yeah.
Yes.
While we're at it.
No, don't talk about it.
We're too embarrassed. We're too shameful to talk. Ashamed to talk about shame. Yeah, I mean, I think that the negotiation with yourself is the most complex and is very tied into identity, who we want to be, and that the feedback that we have for ourselves, because we hold ourselves to such high standards, I want to be perfectly fair and perfectly caring and always well liked, and that's just not reality. I mean, partly because we have identities and roles that are in tension with each other. If I think of myself as responsive to clients or students, and I think of myself as a good parent, there are going to be moments where I am with my kid and the phone rings and I know it's important. And I have to make choices. So with life so complicated, our feelings are also complicated, and that feelings usually come in not as singles, but as bundles of complicated, seemingly contradictory feelings, right? Yeah. I love you and you're driving me crazy right now. I love you and I cannot believe I ever thought this was going to work. And I'm ashamed of the ways in which I've contributed to this problem. And I'm furious about the ways that you have contributed to this problem. And I think being able to hold those things being simultaneously true is part of that human development challenge, and negotiating with myself for what do I need to let go of some of that, or what does that produce. Doug, Doug has described to me a hypothesis about when we're stuck in blame and want revenge, or I just want them to feel the same pain they're causing me in some way.
Forced empathy. Yeah.
Forced. Yes. Inflicted empathy.
Yeah. I mean, that's,
yeah.
Is that not violence? Yeah.
Yeah. Invited empathy. There we go. Strongly invited. His hypothesis is that it comes from a combination of unacknowledged feelings and self frustration or shame about our own contribution to the problem, and that gets us stuck, which is interesting. And there's a woman in New Zealand who has said something to me, Nicola. I'm going to have to, we'll put it in your show notes because I have to remind myself of her last name. It starts with H. But she's like, all conflict is about loss.
That resonates.
Even if it's just a loss of your sense of self as someone who doesn't hurt other people, or loss of something you thought might be possible, but this conflict tells you it's not, of your fantasy future.
That resonates with me only because I'm thinking about how informative grief has been to my understanding of conflict. And I also want to suggest that conflict can be, building up. So maybe it is a tearing down and a building up if done well. It's interesting because as I'm hearing you talk, part of what I'm wondering is if, as a society, like Americans especially, are we just like too obsessed with identity? If some of this hanging on to identity is part of the issue with interpersonal conflicts. I'm a big fan of Tilda Swinton, the actress. And I heard her the other day. She's such an interesting creature and might be extraterrestrial. I'm not sure, but she was talking about, she was like, you humans are so obsessed with identity. She's like, you want to know who you are and what you are about and all this stuff. And she's like, life is so much more transient than that. And you are, one day something, the next day another. And she just was talking about this even as an actor, that part of her job is to inhabit different identities. But someone who thinks about conflict a lot, I was like, wow, I'm going to resolve this summer. I don't know if it's going to go well. I'm going to resolve this summer to just think of care way less about my identity and see how that goes. Like, why is that so important to me that I am, and then all of these things that follow. I don't know. I haven't really gotten anywhere with it, so TBD. But I'm curious. I mean, do you think that's a part of it? Do you think that is that even possible to resolve to care less about identity?
And is that fixed to growth mindset that you talk about in terms of the final shift, or?
Yeah, it's so interesting.
Or
I guess
is it key in development too?
It's probably all related. I mean, number one, it makes me think about why it's so hard to extend ourselves the compassion and grace that we often find easy to extend to others or recommend to others. The second is that I do think that we tend to hold identity as either or. Either I'm a good person or a bad person, competent or incompetent, successful or a failure. When and grounding your identity in a conversation is about actually complexifying it and giving yourself space to be a well-intentioned human who's going to make mistakes, and to really ground yourself in what's true, which is way more complex and then relaxed, which is maybe similar to what she's saying, but it's actually not caring less. It's being more aligned with reality, maybe.
Having an open palm about it.
And yeah, that's a beautiful way to put it. And I do think that social media, PR is all about single messaging. like projecting an image, singular or
Yeah.
whatever. And that's not helping our human tendency anyway, because sharing how mixed we each are as humans and evolving always and not necessarily in linear ways, gets judgment from other people. So why make yourself vulnerable in that way to strangers? But then in trying to shy away from it, we don't make ourselves vulnerable to ourselves or to the people that really we care about and care about us around us, who actually could help us on that journey together.
Sheila, I'm wondering, just to ask a convoluted question. Is there something in the DNA of the Harvard literature and Harvard and or the New England and or Protestantism that makes us struggle with shame? And I'm thinking about, like, my understanding of Torah is that the Hebrew Bible is that there are multiple creation stories, which is interesting. One, in terms of Adam and Eve, kind of demonstrates maybe a developmental allegory of Eden, perfection, like when you're a baby and you have no narcissistic wounds and everything is wonderful and everyone is happy to see you and all that, ideally, not for everyone. And then the idea of becoming sexually conscious to some extent, or the shame of like puberty even, and being cast out of Eden is actually an allegory for a narcissistic wound, which I really like. And I say narcissistic, not in a negative way, but in like a Heinz Kohut type of way. But I'm just wondering if some of the shame of our libidinal desires, even that I would say that I have needs and wants, or even, I don't know, I'm wondering if this is all part of it, because I sometimes think about the Roger Fisher as Jesus, getting to yes as the Bible, and maybe DIFCON as like Mishnah, Gemara. But in terms of, just to finish the kind of the Durkheim theory of social religion, and Harvard as the church. And I guess my question is, what is good about that actually, in terms of like, what Harvard has been able to do in terms of the negotiation project, and to what extent might our religio-cultural contemporary mindset about needs, wants, desire hold us back from where you might like to see the field going?
Well, it's good that we're taking it as a narrow question. So I mean, you've got me thinking about a few. I don't know that they're answers, but I'm noticing them. You're raising them as factors. So maybe, and by the way, my personal bent is not to hold things put them on a pedestal in this way, because, as my mother used to say, human beings have a way of letting you down. And I was like, Mom, that's your inspirational, teachings. Like, that is horrible. But I think I've come to understand she means give people some grace.
Yeah.
Like, your expectations about what you were hoping from them, and even theirs, may not come to fruition. And okay, like, let's give each other some grace. And so Harvard as the church is, that's not necessarily a great
no, it's parochial
thing to aspire to. Yeah.
And at the same time,
it's parochial and flawed and all that.
And just to maybe wind up before I sound so critical, it's from reading about your work and Roger's work and Harvard that I ended up anywhere near here, because it was so inspirational. The idea that there was a project that wanted to bridge theory and research and literature and the real fucking world, and had some, from what I can tell, if not outright successes, really nudging in the right direction. And I think whenever you're embedded enough to train both sides, and we need more than two sides, but I'm thinking about like South African apartheid, US Soviet agenda,
Ireland.
There's so much
Cyprus.
good news.
Yes.
And so that is something that if Colleen and I and our crew can be any small part of, is a dream come true. And so I'm just to say, that's why I'm here. I think that's why a lot of us are here. And I think Harvard has given reach and credibility and stature so that when we talk about these things, but I'm also, just to kind of bring in the gender piece as well, I kind of wonder, like, how much how much do I need to talk about U.S. Special Forces and that I do jujitsu so that I can talk about love and feelings? And to what extent is negotiation just the masculine coding of communication so that we can sell it to corporations?
Well, one of the things that I think is core to the field, and not just at Harvard, is that it really came out of one of the darkest periods of world history. Because if you look at the early pioneers, Roger fought in World War II,
right,
and lost all of his roommates. Frank Sander, the grandfather of mediation, spent part of his childhood in a concentration camp and lost most of his family. Thomas Schelling came out of traumatic war, and these people found each other in the post-war period. And I wonder whether we would look back today and say part of what helped them with the trauma of that experience of seeing what human beings are capable of doing to each other was turning it into something meaningful and searching for, there's gotta be a better way.
Yeah.
And how do we figure that out? And so there was like this renaissance blossoming of cross-disciplinary work because they each came back from the war, went into different fields, but came together around what do we need to learn here and how do we learn from each other and invite other people into that inquiry. So that, Howard Rafa, you look at early pioneers and you say, wow, they were working out something on their own behalfs, perhaps, but certainly on behalf of what do we need to learn as a species if we're going to not go through that again. And so I do think that created an openness and a curiosity. Yeah. That also, and maybe because by the time I met Roger, which would have been in 1991, he also wasn't at a stage of his career where he needed to impress anybody, right? So he got curious about feelings, and he got curious, and he was totally open to collaborating with family therapists.
Jody
Shire and Rick Lee and Sally Ann Roth to create the interpersonal skills exercise and open to what's going on emotionally as well as analytically that will help us understand and change the way someone could handle in a conflict that's important to them. So, and he was looking both at individual conflicts with your, business partner, spouse, roommate, child, and global conflicts, right? Getting hostages out of Iran. And constitutional talks in South Africa. And he felt like it's all the same humanity showing up in both its flaws, tragic flaws, and pain, and also its resilience and capacity to heal.
So as we wind down, I'm wondering, two-part question. One is
I don't want it to be over.
Was that your internal voice?
Yes.
I love that unmediated internal voices. Well, I guess I'm wanting to end with, if I'm listening and I'm involved in a difficult conversation, which I probably am, either because I'm avoiding it or because I'm actively in it, whether it's coworker or family, or likely a coworker because they remind me of some familial relationship. I'm wondering if there's anything from IPS that you can talk about as much or as little as you like that I might be able to do myself to practice, to do the work, to be ideally better about how I handle these conversations, and as a result, have more positive ripples throughout our ecosystems.
IPS, the Interpersonal Skills Exercise, was created as a collaboration between the Harvard Negotiation Project and the Family Institute of Cambridge, which trains family therapists. So they have a super deep and nuanced sense of group dynamics family dynamics, and then in negotiation speak, we would say group dynamics, and the interactive nature of conversation and exploration. And so that married sort of the analytical negotiation stuff with their gift, which we learned so much from them. One of the most valuable steps, so the interpersonal skills exercise is a very step-by-step process. And one of the steps that's the most powerful is that after telling your side of the story and here's what I'm struggling with, here's what I would love to have happen, here's the skill I wonder whether I need to work on, or maybe I'm not sure what it is because I can't figure out what else to try. We interview you as you. We then invite you to sit physically in a different chair to become what we call your absent party, the other person in your situation. Let's imagine it's your ex-best friend. And
Spicy.
Yeah, exactly. And we interview you as them, and you have to speak in the first person. So we'd say, what's your name? How old are you? Sounds like you used to be friends with so-and-so. Tell us about that. And the person has to speak as their counterpart in the first person. And what's interesting is that after that, and we ask all manner of questions, once they get out of the chair and come back to their own chair and we say, any insights there? They're like, wow. Like, I have thought about their perspective so much over the years, but I always thought about it from my own perspective rather than actually, there's something about physically sitting in their chair and having to speak as the first person that gives you a little bit more access to the landscape of what their thoughts and feelings and experiences might look like. You have to be careful not to be sure, but it sparks more curiosity about it.
I wonder if some of that eye language also helps with embodiment, like what we were talking about earlier, of actually physically feeling some of it and having that visceral thing that is, superseding the cerebral. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's really well put. It's aligning the intellectual and the physical and the emotional in a way that gives you aligned access, maybe.
Yeah.
So that step then often changes people's purposes for the conversation. It changes how they want to approach it, or invite a different kind of conversation. So that step is probably the one that is the most important.
Yeah.
And there needs to be I think a book written about how do you get people into that exercise and into that chair itself. But really quickly, just as we end, Colleen and I want to get your thoughts on our book that we were thinking about.
Yeah.
Just our book idea. Colleen, can you tell Sheila
No, this isn't real, but we always joke about writing a book that's called Talking About Listening. Just because there's no...
Love it.
Yeah.
Sheila, thank you so much for taking the time amongst your many important projects.
I have a final question.
Yeah, please.
If I might.
Yeah.
Do you have any rules of conflict or difficult conversations? Any laws? Anything that you, over the years, have come to live by?
Yeah, there's actually something that I said to my son recently. So I have 2 boys and a girl, and both of my sons, who are in their 20s, are in relationships. And we were talking about how you handle conflict in relationships over dinner one night. And also talking about, like, at what stage do you know whether this is the right person or not? Yeah. And one of the things that seems super obvious to me now that I would not have guessed before is that in a intimate relationship, the ironclad rule is that even when you are so angry and you're just so done that, like, what's the harm? I'm just going to say, like, what would really hurt that person because you know them that well.
Mm-hmm.
And still, when you're in conflict with them, you don't say it.
Yeah.
That there are guardrails on how you treat each other, even when you're mad.
Yeah.
That mean you don't do damage that I hesitate to use the word irreparable, because I think there's a lot that is reparable if we give it space and time and effort. But just don't do the damage in the first place.
Yeah.
And that those guardrails and ground rules for how we fight can make a huge difference. And when they're not in place, that's going to be a tough road. And those come from your childhood. What did you see your parents have any guardrails in place for what they said to each other and the names they called each other, or the whatever, the behavior that happened, which doesn't mean sweep it under the rug.
Right.
But it means that you do have some ironclad rules that even when you don't want to live by them, you're like,
stick to them.
That seems like a bad rule to me right now, but okay, fine.
Yeah.
I'll stick to it. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah.
Colleen, do you want to share the one that like I've now adopted too about don't fight with anyone?
Oh, yeah. My rule of conflict is never fight with anyone you don't love. It's just too costly, too hard.
I love that one.
It's unrealistic, of course, and most of my
No,
work
but
is like talking to people about having to deal with people they certainly don't love. But there's some truth in it for me, at least.
But doing the emotional work that we're talking about in terms of like the cognitive and emotional investment, I don't know anyone who can do that with one person, let alone all the people in your life. So at least to me, it's like if I'm engaging in this sacred communication in this mode that sucks and takes a lot of energy, that's how I'm going to show you that I love you, that I'm going to try very hard not to say those things.
It's
sacred communication is a reframe for all reframes.
I love that. Actually, can I share a poem?
Please.
We love poetry here.
Just made me think of it.
You know what we should do this every time, to have someone conclude with a poem, their favorite poem or something.
Yes.
So this spring, I ran across this poet. His name is Jared K. Anderson. I now own all 3 of his slim volumes in this series because they are so amazing. And you just made me think of this one. So it's called Sentry, meaning like someone who protects something. Kindness, gentleness, empathy. These things are fires shining in the forest night. They must be tended, but in tending them, we are illuminated. We become a target for things that thrive in darkness. So, as ever, love is risk, and, as ever, worth the danger.
I love that so much.
Wow.
He's good.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of the reasons that it spoke to me is just, it does feel risky to be in a relationship. It does feel risky to be in leadership.
Yep.
These days. The world feels risky right now, and the media cycles and all of that. And kindness and empathy and connection is worth that risk.
And Sheila, your ongoing like conversation with criticism to blame, victim blaming, whatever, that conversation you had with Tim Ferriss, for me was very helpful, because like it's my worst nightmare for someone to be like, you're doing this like evil thing that you're not supposed to do in this emerging counter world. Yeah. And it's just, it's a great modeling that like that those things can happen and you can engage with it productively. Right. And thus do it. So I don't know, you're a hero of ours. And yeah, this was so cool. Thank you for taking the time to do it.
Thank you guys for doing this. And what you have created a space and invited a conversation that's deeper than most. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Sheila. We appreciate you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Mindful Negotiating Show. If you liked it, there's more. Check out our Instagram at Mindful Negotiating to stay tuned for our next episode, and send us your questions, comments, or suggestions for specific resources that would make your negotiations with yourself and with others easier to approach. You can find more information in the description and on our website at mindfulnegotiating.com. Happy negotiating.